Now we're moving into this JFK story, which I find fascinating. I just love it when people reveal information about some of these previous presidents that we've had that we may not have been aware of. And this article recently written by Rick Sterling, so on Mint Press News, Rick will be here Friday, not just to talk about this article, but some other things connected to this that he wants to discuss as well. But I want you to think about the situation that's happening in Israel and Gaza right now. I want you to think about some of the things that RFK Jr. has said in reference to where his father stood with Israel and where JFK stood with Israel as well. And then I want you to dive into this. From Dallas to Gaza, the JFK assassination was good for Zionist Israel. Grab your popcorn, grab some tea. We're going to get into this tonight. President JFK was assassinated 60 years ago. If he had lived and won a second term, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would have evolved differently. Possibly the path towards Israeli apartheid and genocide in Gaza could have been avoided. In his short time in office, Kennedy significantly changed U.S. foreign policy. As documented in the book JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Still Matters, JFK resisted the CIA and military-industrial complex in the policies he set regarding the Third World and the Soviet Union. The Vietnam War, the assassination of Indonesia's President Sukarno, and continued hostility to Cuba and the Soviet Union would not have happened had Kennedy lived and won a second term. So that makes you think maybe that has something to do with the reason why they decided that JFK had to go. And the reality is, he most likely would have won a second term. Less well known, Kennedy's policies also challenged and opposed the military and political ambitions of Zionist Israel. At the time, Israel had only existed for 13 years. It was still evolving, and the course was not set. There was a significant international resolve to find a compromise solution regarding Palestinian refugees from the 1948 Nakba. When Israel attacked Egypt and seized the Sinai Peninsula in 1956, the Eisenhower administration demanded Israel withdraw from the captured territory. They complied. At this time, in the early 1960s, prominent Jewish voices criticized the racism and discrimination of the Israeli government. Let me come out and say this again. Did you catch that? During that time, prominent Jewish voices criticized the racism and discrimination of the Israeli government. Israelis like Martin Buber assailed Ben-Gurion and noted that at the inception of the state, complete equality with the Jewish citizens was promised to the Arab population. Many influential Israelis realized their long-term security and well-being depended on finding a just settlement with the indigenous Palestinian population. In the United States, the Jewish community was divided and many were anti-Zionist. The American Council for Judaism was influential and anti-nationalist. Hear that? The racist and aggressive character of Israel was not yet set in stone, nor was American Jewish support for Israel. So again, people, this is before super PACs. This is before organizations like AIPAC actually had a foothold in Congress. Money changed everything, nor was American Jewish support for Israel. When Menachem came to the U.S. in 1948, prominent Jewish leaders, including Albert Einstein, denounced him. They said Begin, who later became Israeli prime minister, was a terrorist who preached an admixture of ultra-nationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority. Many American Jews had mixed feelings and did not identify with Israel. Others supported Israel, but based on there being peace with the indigenous Palestinians. That was in the 1960s. So don't let people tell you that you're crazy for wanting peace with the Palestinian people. There are 4 key areas where Kennedy's policy substantially differed from what followed his death. And there's a picture of JFK there. Now check this out. Despite what other people are telling you, Kennedy was not biased towards Israel. The Kennedy administration sought good relations with both Israel and Arab nations. Kennedy aimed to extend U.S. influence throughout the Middle East, including with countries friendly with the Soviet Union and at odds with NATO partners. JFK personally supported Arab and African nationalism. Say what? How many of you knew that? JFK supported Arab and African nationalism. Think about all the things that have happened after JFK died. Remember, Barack Obama said we had to go take Gaddafi out. They wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. Why? Because Gaddafi did not want to partner with the West, and he really wanted countries in Africa to rely on their own. He wanted to break away from the stronghold of the West. So they said he got to go. As a senator in 1957, he criticized the Eisenhower administration for supporting and sending weapons to France in their war against the Algerian independence movement. In a 9,000-word presentation to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he criticized Western imperialism and called for the U.S. to support Algerian independence. JFK criticized Western imperialism. Do you see it, guys? They couldn't allow someone like that to remain in the White House. Kennedy changed the previous frosty relations with the United Arab Republic, Egypt, and Syria, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. For the first time, the U.S. approved loans to them. Kennedy wrote respectful letters to the Arab presidents before he welcomed Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to Washington. The Arab leaders could see the difference and responded with the appreciation. Those who claim there was no difference with Kennedy ignore that Egypt's Nasser, Algeria's Ben Bella, and other nationalist leaders saw a big difference. In 1960, Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency. He spoke at the Zionist of America convention. He made complimentary remarks about Israel, but also expressed the need for friendship with all the people of the Middle East. He said the U.S. should act promptly and decisively against any nation in the Middle East which attacks its neighbor, and the Middle East needs water, not war, tractors, not tanks, bread, not bombs. Some of the same things that people are criticizing today when we talk about the humanitarian need. Some people criticizing that. He said they needed those things back then. Kennedy frankly told the Zionists, "I cannot believe that Israel has any real desire to remain indefinitely a garrison state surrounded by fear and hate. By maintaining objectively and neutrality on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Kennedy wanted to steer Jewish Zionists away from the racist, aggressive, and ultra-nationalistic impulses that have led to where we are today." So when you hear RFK Jr. say his father would have done this, or JFK, they stood and by Israel and backed Israel, notice RFK Jr. isn't telling you that piece. That JFK wanted people to stay away from the racists and nationalists. And here you have RFK Jr. buddy with Rabbi Shmuley. It's important for people to understand. This piece right here is also very important. Kennedy wanted Israel to follow the rules. You don't say. The second difference in Kennedy's policy is regarding Zionist lobbying on behalf of Israel. Under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, organizations that promote or lobby on behalf of a foreign government must register and account for their finances and activities. Under Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the Department of Justice instructed the American Zionist Council to register as agents of a foreign country. AZC is the parent organization of the American Israel Public Affairs Council, also known as AIPAC. As documented in detail here on November 21st, 1962, the Assistant Attorney General wrote to them, the receipt of such funds from the American sections of the Jewish Agency for Israel constitutes that the American Zionist Council, an agent of a foreign principal, the council's registration is requested. This brings up the point that some have made that when it comes to organizations like AIPAC, technically they're basically trying to lobby for a foreign nation, which is true. And so the point that JFK and RFK made back then is that they should have to register as agents of a foreign country. The emergence of Israeli political influence was also scrutinized in the Senate. Under Senator William Fulbright, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held hearings in May and August 1963. They revealed that tax-free donations to the United Jewish Appeal, supposedly for humanitarian relief in Israel, were being channeled back to the U.S., where the money was used for lobbying and Israeli public relations. I call that fraud. Attorneys for AZC stalled for time. On August 16, 1963, a DOJ analyst reviewed the case and concluded, department should insist on the immediate registration of the American Zionist Council under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. October 11th, the DOJ demanded that the AZC register, and the department expects a response from you within 72 hours. On October 17th, the DOJ memorandum reports that attorneys for AZC pleaded for not being required to register as foreign agents. They offered to provide the necessary financial disclosures, but that registering as a foreign agent would be so publicized by the American Council on Judaism that it would eventually destroy the Zionist movement. So the point made is this. If you are lobbying on behalf of another country, you should have to register as a foreign agent. The politicians in this country are supposed to work for people in this country and help out this country. They pushed back heavily against that because they said it would hurt the Zionist movement. So when RFK gets on all these interviews and he tells people that his father stood with Israel and that JFK also stood with Israel, he should probably also mention this part too. As indicated in this discussion, political Zionism was not yet dominant in the American Jewish community and was actively opposed by the American Council on Judaism and other Jewish groups. Now, that is important because Jewish Voices for Peace is getting a lot of hate from people because they've been going to the pro-Palestinian protests and they're saying, not in our name. This is not how we feel. This is not okay. But I just want to remind you, during that time, during the 60s, the majority of the American Jewish community was like Jewish Voices for Peace. I'm so glad he wrote this article. Here's the third piece. Kennedy supported Palestinian rights. A third difference is regarding Palestinian rights. Although he was only 44 when he became president, Kennedy had more international experience than most U.S. presidents. In 1939, he spent 2 weeks in Palestine. He described the situation and difficulties in a lengthy letter to his father. He wrote, "The sympathy of the people on the spot seems to be with the Arabs. This is not only because the Jews have had at least some of their leaders an unfortunately arrogant, uncompromising attitude, but they feel that after all, the country has been Arabic for the last few hundred years. Palestine was hardly Britain's to give away." Oh. But see, if you're saying this today, if you're a politician and you make that statement that JFK said back then, you're the evil person. You're called anti-Semitic. In comments that are still true, Kennedy remarks how the Jewish residents are divided between a strongly Orthodox Jewish group unwilling to make any compromise and a liberal Jewish element composed of the younger group who fear these reactionaries. His analysis is sympathetic to both Jewish and Arab peoples and addresses the difficulty but necessity of finding a compromise solution. In the early 1960s, the U.S. State Department was not locked into a biased acceptance or approval of Israeli policies. The U.S. supported UN Resolution 194, which stated that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practical date, and that compensation should be paid to the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or property damage, which under principles of international law or equity should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. This has become known as the right of return. You'll see a picture of Kennedy there. It says JFK at the 1963 Anti-Defamation League Award Dinner in DC. So RFK likes to tell you that they did stand by Israel, JFK, and of course his father, RFK. But what he leaves out is that those organizations were not like that at that time. And he also leaves out the fact that JFK actually had sympathy for both the Israelis and the Palestinian people, and that he wanted a solution. That brings us into the two-state solution idea and all those kind of things. Even back then, he said, stay away from the racist, nationalist rhetoric that's coming from the state of Israel. November 21st, 1963, the day before Kennedy's assassination, the New York Times had two news stories that exemplified the discord between Washington and Tel Aviv. A report from the United Nations is titled, "Israel Dissents as UN Group Backs U.S. on Arab Refugees." It begins, "A United States resolution calling for continued efforts to resolve the predicament of the Palestinian Arab refugees was approved tonight 83-1. Israel cast a single negative vote. The issue centers on the 1948 resolution, whose key section, paragraph 11, concerns the future of the Arabs who are displaced from their homes by the Palestine conflict. They have been living in the lands bordering Israel. The revised United text calls on the Palestinian Consolation Commission to continue its efforts for the implementation of paragraph 11. So do you see what they were trying to warn people about back then? The vote was 83-1. Israel was the negative vote. Again, I just want to remind people, this is before Hamas even existed. The point that I'm trying to make to you is that the Zionists didn't want the people there, period. They didn't want the Palestinian people there. So when people come to you and they say, well, it's because of Hamas, send them, and we'll put this in the chat, send them this article. This was always the plan. The second New York Times story is titled, "U.S. Stand Angers Israel." See what's happening? It reports from Jerusalem that Premier Levi Eshkol expressed extreme distaste today for the United States position in the Palestine refugee debate. Israel's anger was conveyed in the strongest terms to the U.S. ambassador. The Israeli government is upset about the American resolution before the UN Political Committee and by American maneuvers over the issue. Israel was angered and objected because the Kennedy administration was trying to resolve the Palestinian refugee situation, including the right of return. JFK wanted the Palestinian people to have the right of return. And if JFK would have lived and would have served a second term, that would have happened. And this is the final piece. Kennedy tried to stop Israel's nuclear program. The fourth and most considerable contention between Kennedy and the Israeli leadership was regarding their developing nuclear weapons. This issue was so secret that crucial documents and letters have only been released recently. President Kennedy was a strong advocate for stopping nuclear proliferation. After 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, he realized how easy it would be to intentionally or accidentally trigger a catastrophic nuclear war. If nuclear weapons were allowed to spread to more countries, the risk of global catastrophe would be all the greater. It was also predicted that if Israel acquired nuclear weapons capability, they would become more aggressive and less likely to reach a compromised agreement regarding Palestinian refugees. And look at where we are today. When intelligence indicated that Israel might be trying to build a nuclear weapon at Dimona in 1962, Kennedy was determined to find out if this was true and, if so, to stop it. This caused an intense diplomatic confrontation between JFK and Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. The proof of this has recently been revealed in the exchange of letters between President Kennedy and Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and his successor, Levi Eshkol. They are all labeled top secret or eyes only. We weren't supposed to know about this. It is essential to see the sequence and some details to understand how intense this showdown was. These communications are all from 1963. Author's note, skip to the next section if you wish to skip the details outlined in the following exchanges. So we're going to skip some of this because it is kind of a lot here. But I do want to read this part. April 26, Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion replied to President Kennedy. He evaded the issue of nuclear facility inspections and instead expressed his concern regarding a recent proclamation from Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. He compared Egyptian President Nasser to Germany's Hitler. You see this? So here is that documentation here. And again, we'll put the link in the chat so you guys can read this on your own time as well. I don't want to go through all of it because it is quite lengthy. But this part right here, you do need to see. For many years now, the rulers of the Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and others, have been making public declarations of their firm determination to obliterate Israel. So, do you see what was happening here? No, do not give the Palestinian people the right to return. No, you can't take away our nuclear weapons. We have to have those because we've been receiving threats from the Arab states that they're going to make Israel disappear, basically. They're going to get rid of all the Israeli people. Were those things actually true? I could fill quite a thick booklet with the pronouncement of rulers, army commanders, official newspapers, and the radio stations of Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and other Arab capitals on the destruction of Israel. In recent days, something unique, I believe, in the history of the nations has happened. On April 17th, a treaty of federation was signed in Cairo between the three countries, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Before he puts his signature to the treaty, the president of Egypt prayed to God for the success of the federation. If the Lord willed, he said, this would be the parent federation of all Arab states for the good of the Arab people. So the Arab states and the Arab people are not allowed to have some type of self-determination? Let's fast forward here, because there's a lot of these documents. But I wanted you to actually see the documents, because you can see they're now declassified. So, this isn't just Rick just writing an article based on what he heard. Rick actually had the receipts here. It's very long, though. And it says this document is from the holdings of the National Security Archive. Now, it goes on to say here, I just want to jump to the end part here, because they go through all these letters. And my apologies, it's very, 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 very long. This part. June 16th, the U.S. Embassy in Israel reported that Ben-Gurion resigned as Israel's prime minister. This was a huge surprise. The explanation was that it was for personal reasons. Ben-Gurion likely knew the contents of the forthcoming letter from Washington received at the embassy the day before. The impact of his resignation was to stall for time. U.S. Ambassador Barber suggested waiting until the cabinet problem is worked out before sending JFK's near ultimatum to the next prime minister. Kennedy did not wait long. On July 4th, he wrote to new Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. After congratulating Eshkol on becoming the new prime minister, he goes straight to the point concerning American visits to Israel's nuclear facility in Dimona. Kennedy says, I regret having to add to your burdens too soon after your assumption of office. But he then goes on to request inspections, as was requested in the letter to Ben-Gurion, and that support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized if this is not done. So again, Ben-Gurion resigns to kind of stall so that Kennedy cannot come to Israel and have the inspection of the weapons, the nuclear weapons that they had. It goes on to say, July 17th, Eshkol wrote to Kennedy that he needed to study the issue more before responding to Kennedy's request to visit Dimona. Again, that's just more stalling, okay? I need to study it more. August 19th, Eshkol wrote to Kennedy, reiterating Dimona's peaceful purpose and ignoring the request for a summer inspection. He proposed the inspection take place towards the end of 1963. August 26th, Kennedy wrote to Eshkol to accept the visit at year end, but emphasized that it needed to be done when the reactor's core is being loaded and before the internal radiation hazards have developed. Kennedy set these conditions because they were essential for determining whether the facility could be used for developing a nuclear weapon. September 16th, the State Department prepared a memorandum of conversation with a counselor from the British Embassy. There was joint concern, but agreement that Dimona would be visited and inspected prior to the activation of the reactor. This part right here. After LBJ became president, U.S. Mideast policy changed significantly. LBJ told an Israeli diplomat from the start, you have lost a great friend, but you have found a better one. The Israeli publication Haaretz says historians generally regard Johnson as the president most uniformly friendly to Israel. The Washington Report on Middle East Affairs writes LBJ was the first to align U.S. policy with Israel's policies. Everybody listening to what's happening here? JFK was president. LBJ was vice president. JFK is assassinated. LBJ is promoted to president. LBJ is the first to align U.S. policy with Israel's policies. Well, I'll be damned. Learning some history tonight. On the crucial issue of the Dimona inspection, the Israelis ignored JFK's condition and the reactor went critical on December 26. When the inspection occurred 3 weeks later, they could not inspect the areas that had been irradiated. A handwritten comment on the report says, "We were supposed to see this first!" Exclamation point there. We do not know what would have happened if JFK had been in the White House, but given the intensity of his effort and deep convictions regarding the dangers of nuclear proliferation, it would not have been ignored as it was under LBJ. Under LBJ, relations with Egypt deteriorated. The U.S. stopped providing direct assistance loans and grants to Egypt. The U.S. became increasingly antagonistic to President Nasser, as desired by the Israel lobby. This is the information that RFK leaves out. That if JFK would have lived and won that second term, the Zionist movement wouldn't have spread as much as it did. We dropping heat tonight. The DOJ efforts to require the American Zionist Council to register as a foreign agent became increasingly weak until they were dropped under LBJ's new Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach. The sequence of exchanges includes, so they talk about how they wrote that letter, yada, yada. I'm going to jump forward a little bit here. In the summer of 1964, Nicholas became Attorney General. Negotiations continued. The DOJ staff noted that AZC was stalling and not providing acceptable information despite the increasingly special and favorable treatment. In the spring of 1965, the DOJ accepted that AZC was not required to register as a foreign agent. So you see what happened here, folks? They were able to stall and push back on this for so long until after the point where JFK was then assassinated, LBJ becomes president. The new Attorney General also pushed for this, but they were able to stall for so long, eventually it got to the point where the US government gave in. And that inspection did not happen. Neither did the two-state solution, the self-determination for the Palestinian people, neither the right to return. This is the last piece here. An increasingly aggressive, uncompromising Israel. The successful development of nuclear weapons added to Israel's aggressive actions and unwillingness to resolve the Palestinian refugee crisis. With intelligence information provided by Washington, Israel made a surprise attack on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in June of 1967. The Six-Day War was a crucial turning point in Middle East history. Israel quickly defeated the unprepared combined armies. In the West, public perception of Israel changed overnight. The mythology of Israeli military and general superiority was created. Among American Jewish population, doubts and concerns about Israel evaporated and support skyrocketed. If you haven't had a chance to do so, go ahead and smash that like button, buddy. This is deep. Shout out to Rick Sterling for this article. Again, Rick will be here Friday. It goes on to say Israel leaders' arrogance and deceit are exemplified by the attack on the USS Liberty during the Six-Day War. The communications naval vessel was monitoring the airwaves in the Eastern Mediterranean when it was attacked by Israeli aircraft and boats. 34 U.S. sailors were killed and 172 injured. Amazingly, the ship managed to stay afloat. The plan was evidently to sink the vessel, blame it on Egypt, and consolidate U.S. support and hostility to Egypt and the Soviet Union. And ladies and gentlemen, here we are. This event was covered up for decades. And this is the last piece here. Again, shout out to Rick because he did the damn thing. We do not know for sure what might have happened had JFK not been assassinated. It is possible that Israel would have been stopped from acquiring the bomb. Without that, they may not have had the audacity to launch the 1967 attacks on their neighbors, seizing the Golan, West Bank, and Gaza Strip. If the Zionist lobby had been required to register as foreign agents, their influence would have been moderated. Perhaps Israel could have found a reasonable accommodation with Palestinians in one or two states. Instead, Israel hardened into an apartheid regime, committing increasingly outrageous massacres. As Kennedy warned in 1960, Israel has become a garrison state surrounded by hate and fear. The assassination of JFK ensured Zionist control of Israel, suffering for Palestinians, and permanent instability. Eric, can we put the link to that article in the chat so people have that on their own as well? Shout out to Rick Sterling for that article. Again, he'll be here Friday. He's going to talk about this and some other things as well about how this is relevant today. But the point is, people, next time someone comes to you and they say, well, they have to do this because of Hamas. Did they have to do that attack on 1967 because of Hamas? No. AIPAC was never registered as a foreign agent, should have been. They continued to stall to make sure that didn't happen. And it's true. Public support for it would have decreased, wouldn't have increased if they were registered as a foreign agent. Yet you have the DOJ going after activists and socialists in this country and calling them Russian agents. But here you have an entire organization that's lobbying in Congress, and they've got over 400 congressmen and women under their damn control. But you're going after the activist who's in the streets saying, stop the wars. I truly believe that if JFK had lived, I truly believe we would have had a different country. So RFK, when you talk about your father and when you talk about your uncle, make sure you mention that part. Let's go to some of the comments here in the chat. Shout out to Zen Master, says it's Festivus for the rest of us. Zen Master has been a member for 1 month. Give Zen a big whoop whoop. Thank you, Eric. At this point, Sabby, I wouldn't be surprised if the Israeli state played a role in the assassination of Malcolm X. What did they say? When I reported that, they said, sorry, I'm getting comfy. They said FBI, NYPD, and I thought there was another one, but that would be interesting. Thank you for the super chat medal. I think that JFK was better on Palestine than RFK Jr. is now. God damn. Yes, indeed. Oh, I think my camera's a little fuzzy. Okay, there we go. And thank you, James. RFK must feel like a dumb bell. Thank you, Muhammad. It saddens me to think many good people have been assassinated in this country. Thank you, Sabby, and stay well, everyone. And thank you, Willis. This is why you're invaluable, Sabby. Thank you, sis 100. Oh, thank you so much. Look, we gotta do the truth. We gotta drop the truth bombs tonight. Again, Rick will be here Friday. So shout out to Rick for that article. Mint Press News, folks. Mint Press News. Okay.